On October 14, 2023, at 10:47 in the morning, Tyler Crane was 295 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean when his instruments began to lie to him. Tyler, 38 years old, a Navy master diver with 16 years of service and father to 7-year-old twins back in Virginia Beach, had logged over 800 dives in his career, including 12 recovery operations on Cold War-era wreckage. He knew his equipment the way a surgeon knows a scalpel. So, when his compass started spinning like a casino wheel, and his depth gauge flickered between 295 feet and 480 feet while he remained perfectly stationary, he understood immediately that something was fundamentally wrong. The mission itself had been routine, at least on paper. Tyler and his surface partner Brady were conducting a structural assessment dive on a Soviet submarine that had gone down in 1987, 56 nautical miles east of Virginia Beach. The wreck had been sitting undisturbed on the seafloor for 37 years, slowly corroding in 42-degree water. The Navy wanted documentation before deciding whether to attempt salvage or leave it as a maritime grave. Tyler was using a closed-circuit rebreather with trimix gas, standard equipment for technical diving at this depth, and his body camera was recording everything in high definition. He'd descended following proper protocols, completed his safety checks, and was methodically photographing the submarine's titanium hull when the malfunctions began. First the compass, then the depth gauge. Then his dive computer's temperature sensor spiked from 42 degrees Fahrenheit to 68 degrees in less than 10 seconds, which was thermodynamically impossible at this depth. Tyler's heart rate increased, but his breathing remained controlled. 16 years of training had taught him that panic kills faster than equipment failure. He checked his gas mix indicators, his decompression calculations, his backup instruments. Everything was haywire. Then he looked up from his gauges and saw what his instruments had been trying to warn him about. The submarine's hull was glowing, not with bioluminescence, which Tyler had seen hundreds of times, but with a blue-green light that pulsed from inside the corroded metal, as if something within the wreckage had woken up after nearly 4 decades of silence. The pattern wasn't random. It pulsed in steady intervals, mathematical, rhythmic. 6 seconds of light, 2 seconds of darkness. 6 seconds of light. Tyler's training said, document everything, so he did. He adjusted his body camera angle, moved closer to the hull, filmed the light pattern from multiple positions. His hands were steady, even as his mind raced through explanations that made no sense. There was no power source. The submarine's nuclear reactor had been cold for 37 years. There was no reason for anything inside that wreck to be producing light. He tried to radio Brady on the surface. His communication system delivered nothing but distorted static, like someone had taken his voice and shredded it into electronic noise. That was when Tyler made the professional decision that would change everything. He didn't rush. He didn't abandon protocol. He completed his documentation, captured 2 full minutes of footage showing the impossible light, and then began his ascent following the exact decompression schedule required for a dive to 295 feet. The entire time he was rising through the water column, one question burned in his mind like the light he'd just witnessed. His equipment had failed before he saw the glow. As if something had known he was coming and had reached out to touch his instruments first, testing them, reading them, preparing for his arrival. Decompression from 295 feet requires 2 hours and 15 minutes of staged stops at decreasing depths, allowing nitrogen to safely leave the bloodstream without forming bubbles that could paralyze or kill. Tyler spent that time suspended in the water column, alone with his thoughts and the footage stored in his body camera, watching sunlight filter down through the ocean surface 30 feet above him, while his mind replayed the pulsing blue-green light over and over. He'd done everything right, followed every protocol, documented everything professionally, but something in his gut told him that when he surfaced, the world waiting for him would be different than the one he'd left 2 hours and 47 minutes earlier. He broke the surface at 1:19 in the afternoon, right on schedule. Brady was there immediately, helping him onto the dive platform of their support vessel, but Tyler saw it in his partner's face before either of them spoke. Brady's expression wasn't relief or curiosity about the dive. It was something closer to fear, and when he leaned in close while disconnecting Tyler's rebreather, he whispered 4 words that made Tyler's blood run colder than the 42-degree water he'd just left. "They're already here!" Tyler didn't need to ask who. 3 naval vessels were positioned around their small survey boat, gray hulls cutting through the Atlantic swells, close enough that Tyler could read the hull numbers. They hadn't been there when he'd descended. The nearest naval base was Norfolk, 60 nautical miles away, which meant at standard cruising speed, these ships would need at least 1 hour to arrive. Tyler had been underwater for 2 hours and 47 minutes total, including his descent. That meant these vessels had left Norfolk within 35 minutes of Tyler beginning his dive, possibly sooner. Before he'd even reached the wreckage, before he'd seen anything unusual, someone had already dispatched 3 military ships to intercept him. A commander stepped onto their dive platform before Tyler even had his wetsuit half unzipped, flanked by 2 sailors who looked more like security than standard crew. The commander was maybe 50 years old, gray at the temples with the kind of face that gave away nothing, and he never provided his full name, just Commander Holbrook, delivered in a tone that suggested questions would be unwelcome. He held out his hand, not for a handshake, but palm up, expectant. Body camera, GPS dive log, and dive computer. Right now. Tyler had been in the Navy long enough to know when someone was following orders they didn't particularly agree with, and long enough to know that arguing wouldn't change anything, but he tried anyway because 16 years of service had earned him at least that much. "Sir, this is an official Navy survey mission. I have full clearance for this operation, and these recordings are required documentation for the structural assessment report." Holbrook's expression didn't change. "Your clearance doesn't cover what you found down there, Mr. Crane." Tyler felt his stomach drop because he hadn't said anything about finding something unusual, hadn't radioed topside about the light, hadn't communicated anything except standard check-in signals during his ascent, which meant Holbrook already knew what was down there before Tyler surfaced, before Tyler said a word, possibly before Tyler had even descended. The equipment confiscation took less than 3 minutes. Body camera, GPS log, primary and backup dive computers, even his personal waterproof notebook, where he'd sketched the light pattern during his decompression stops. Brady and the 2 civilian marine technicians assisting with the survey were ordered off the vessel, their contracts terminated effective immediately. Their own equipment and documentation also confiscated under what Holbrook called national security protocols. Tyler watched his team being transferred to a Coast Guard cutter that would take them back to Virginia Beach. And then Holbrook turned to him with an expression that might have been sympathy in a different context. "You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending security review. Return to base, await further instructions, and do not discuss this dive with anyone. That includes your wife, your dive partners, and definitely the 2 civilian contractors we just sent home." Tyler had never been placed on administrative leave in 16 years, had never even received a formal reprimand, and now he was being benched for doing exactly what his orders had specified. That night, Sitting at his kitchen table in Virginia Beach while his wife Megan put the twins to bed upstairs, Tyler pulled out his personal laptop and navigated to his backup dive logs, the ones he maintained on his home system following standard Navy protocol that required redundant documentation of all technical dives. Every Navy diver kept backup logs because equipment failed, cameras malfunctioned, and having a secondary record had saved careers when official documentation went missing. Tyler opened the folder containing today's dive data and felt his hands go cold. The files were there, every single one, with the correct file names and timestamps. But when he tried to open them, the data was corrupted, unreadable, as if someone had taken a digital eraser to the contents while leaving the empty shells behind. All of them. His descent log, his depth profile, his gas mixture calculations, his decompression schedule, every backup file from the past 6 months. It was as if someone had reached through the internet into his personal computer in his home and surgically destroyed only the files that mattered, leaving everything else untouched. Tyler closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to Megan reading bedtime stories upstairs, and realized that whatever he'd found at 295 feet was big enough that someone had been monitoring his personal computer, waiting for him to look for the files, maybe watching him right now through the laptop's camera. He'd spent 16 years diving into darkness, but this was the first time the darkness had followed him home. Administrative leave gave Tyler something he rarely had: time to think. And thinking was dangerous, because once you started seeing patterns, you couldn't unsee them. He spent the first 3 days trying to be the husband and father Megan and the twins needed, taking the kids to school, helping with homework, pretending everything was normal administrative paperwork that would resolve itself in a week or two. But on the 4th morning, sitting in his home office while Megan was at work and the twins were at school, Tyler pulled out his personal dive logs from the past 8 years, the handwritten paper backup that no amount of digital corruption could touch. He'd been diving these waters for nearly a decade, knew the seafloor topology the way some people knew their neighborhood streets, and something had been nagging at him since that moment on the dive platform when Commander Holbrook had known about the light before Tyler said anything. If Holbrook knew what was down there, it meant the Navy had been monitoring that wreck, which meant they knew something Tyler didn't. Tyler started mapping every dive he'd logged within 200 miles of Virginia Beach. Civilian maritime charts showed what everyone already knew: that the Cold War had left dozens of wrecks scattered across the continental shelf. Submarines from both sides that had gone down during training exercises, mechanical failures, accidents that were sometimes accidents and sometimes not. The Soviet submarine Tyler had been documenting was just one of 7 confirmed Soviet wrecks in the region, boats that had gone down between 1983 and 1989 during some of the tensest years of underwater cat-and-mouse games between American and Soviet naval forces. 7 submarines lost in 6 years, all officially attributed to different causes: reactor failure, collision with underwater terrain, catastrophic equipment malfunction. Tyler had never thought much about it because the ocean was dangerous and submarines were complicated machines, but now, staring at his handwritten coordinates, something felt wrong about the distribution. He needed better data, which meant he needed help from someone with access to systems he didn't have anymore. Evan Parker was a marine archaeologist who worked with NOAA cataloging historical shipwrecks, a civilian contractor Tyler had worked with twice on joint Navy-NOAA documentation projects. Evan was maybe 45 years old, wore thick glasses that made him look more like a professor than someone who spent half his time on research vessels, and he had the kind of security clearance that gave him access to bathymetric mapping data that most people never saw. Tyler called him from a coffee shop 3 miles from his house, using a prepaid phone he'd bought with cash, because his home phone suddenly felt like it had ears. Evan agreed to meet that afternoon at his office in a No-AA facility near Norfolk. Seemed genuinely happy to hear from Tyler. Asked how the twins were doing. Didn't mention anything about administrative leave, which meant either he didn't know or he was being careful. Tyler spread his handwritten coordinates across Evan's desk an hour later. 7 points marking 7 Soviet submarines lost between 1983 and 1989. Evan looked at them for maybe 10 seconds before he went quiet. The kind of quiet that meant he'd seen something he wished he hadn't. He pulled up his bathymetric mapping software, entered the coordinates Tyler had provided, and added a geometric analysis overlay that connected the 7 points. What appeared on screen made both men stop breathing for a moment. The 7 submarines formed a hexagon that was so close to mathematically perfect that calling it coincidence would require believing in miracles. The maximum deviation of any point from perfect hexagonal geometry was 1.2 miles over a pattern spanning nearly 400 square miles of ocean floor. The odds of 7 accidents occurring over 6 years and randomly forming that pattern were so astronomical that the software couldn't calculate them without scientific notation. Tyler leaned closer to the screen. "What's at the center?" Evan didn't answer immediately, just zoomed the map to the geometric center point of the hexagon, 73 nautical miles east of Virginia Beach. The bathymetric data showed a depression in the seafloor, catalogued in No-AA records as a geological formation of undetermined origin, depth marked at 847 feet. Tyler had never heard of any exploration or survey work at that location, which seemed strange for something this close to major shipping lanes. He said as much, and Evan's expression confirmed what Tyler was starting to suspect. "I tried to get authorization for a survey dive there in 2019, Evan said quietly. Submitted a proposal for geological sampling and photographic documentation. Got rejected within 48 hours. Reason given was environmental protection, marine habitat preservation, but I pulled the ecological surveys for that area. There's nothing there worth protecting. No coral reefs, no endangered species breeding grounds, just open sea floor with average biological activity." They sat there staring at the screen for another minute, at the perfect hexagon of Soviet wrecks surrounding an unexplored depression that someone had made sure stayed unexplored. Tyler was about to ask if Evan had any contacts who might know more about naval operations in that area, when he noticed Evan wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking out the window with an expression that Tyler recognized from combat zones. There was a car parked across the street from the No-AA building, dark blue sedan with Virginia government plates, 2 people visible in the front seats, and it had been there for 40 minutes according to Evan, arrived about 10 minutes after Tyler did. Evan's cell phone started ringing, caller ID showing private number, and he declined the call. It rang again 30 seconds later, same private number, and Evan declined again, but his hand was shaking slightly when he put the phone down. Tyler gathered his papers without being told, thanked Evan for his time in a voice that he hoped sounded casual, and walked toward the building's main entrance like he had nothing to hide. Then he turned down a side corridor, found a service exit that led to a loading dock, and left through the back of the building, walking 4 blocks before calling for a ride from a shopping center parking lot. He didn't see if the blue sedan followed him, but he didn't need to, because he'd already learned everything that mattered. 7 submarines in a perfect hexagon around something at 847 feet. Something that had been glowing with impossible light at 295 feet. And someone was watching everyone who got too close to connecting those dots. Brady called 3 days later using a number Tyler didn't recognize, asked if Tyler wanted to grab coffee at a specific diner 40 minutes outside Virginia Beach, the kind of place that still had physical menus and didn't have security cameras in the parking lot. They sat in a corner booth away from windows, and Brady slid a manila folder across the table like he was passing contraband, which, in a way, he was. Brady had a contact, someone who used to work naval intelligence and was now on a congressional oversight committee reviewing classified military operations, someone who believed that certain things shouldn't stay buried forever, regardless of what the classification stamps said. The documents inside that folder were photocopies, degraded enough that they'd been copied from copies, but the header was still legible. Operation Siren Call, Mission Report, August 1992, Classification Level, Top Secret, Eyes Only. Tyler read for 20 minutes while his coffee went cold, and with each page the world he thought he understood got smaller and stranger. In August of 1992, 3 years after the last Soviet submarine went down in the hexagon pattern, the Navy had sent a deep-sea remotely operated vehicle to the center point, to that depression at 847 feet that Evan had said was catalogued as an unexplored geological formation. The ROV was a military-grade unit capable of operating at depths exceeding 3,000 feet, equipped with high-definition cameras, sonar mapping, and enough lighting to turn midnight water into daylight. It descended on a reinforced steel cable, transmitted data through fiber optic lines, had redundant systems for everything important. The mission log showed that the ROV reached target depth at 847 feet and began its survey at 11:32 in the morning. For 14 minutes, it transmitted video footage, sonar readings, and environmental data. Then, at 11:46, the cable was severed and all transmission stopped. Not worn through, not abraded, not damaged by pressure or equipment failure. The report was very specific about this. The cable was cut, clean separation, as if something down there had decided the ROV had seen enough. The last 8 seconds of video footage had been transcribed into the report, frame-by-frame descriptions, because the actual video files were classified at an even higher level than the mission report itself. What the ROV cameras captured before the cable went dark was something that shouldn't exist in any ocean on Earth. A structure, the report called it, though that word didn't seem adequate for what was described. Massive in scale, approximately 600 feet across at its widest point, with surfaces that reflected light in ways that corroded metal or biological growth never could. The geometry was wrong. Angles that didn't match anything in human engineering or natural formation, and along what might have been the exterior were 7 distinct cables or connections, each one extending outward from the central structure in perfectly spaced radial patterns. The ROV had managed to follow one of those cables for approximately 200 feet before the transmission ended, and the bearing of that cable matched exactly with the location of one of the Soviet submarines. 7 cables, 7 submarines, all positioned at the vertices of a perfect hexagon, like pins on a map marking something that had been planned with mathematical precision. The implications hit Tyler like a depth charge detonating in his chest. The submarines hadn't sunk due to accidents or equipment failures or any of the official explanations that had been recorded in maritime records. They'd been attracted to something, pulled to specific locations, positioned deliberately around whatever was sitting at the center of that pattern at 847 feet. The Soviets had lost 7 boats between 1983 and 1989, investigating something they'd detected but couldn't understand, something that had been active and operational for at least that entire period, and probably much longer. But the revelation that made Tyler's hands shake as he turned to the final page was the section marked Historical Context and Prior Incidents. The Americans had lost vessels too. 3 submarines between 1979 and 1981, before the Soviet losses began, positioned in a smaller triangular pattern inscribed within the larger hexagon. 10 vessels in total over a span of 13 years. 10 crews. 10 boats that the official records said went down for different reasons, scattered across different years, but the classified report told a different story. They'd all been investigating the same thing, approaching from different angles, trying to understand what was broadcasting or emanating or calling from 847 feet down. The document ended with a recommendation section that read like something from a horror story pretending to be bureaucratic language. Continuous monitoring advised. Direct engagement not recommended. Public disclosure would create unacceptable risk of civilian interference and potential activation of unknown defense capabilities. Subject has demonstrated capacity for selective equipment failure and coordinated electromagnetic interference across multiple decades. Origin unknown. Intent unknown. Threat level unknown but presumed high based on historical vessel losses. Status active as of. And then the date was redacted with black marker so thick Tyler couldn't even make out the year. But based on the document date stamps, this report had been updated recently, possibly even after Tyler's own dive in October 2023. Whatever was down there had been operating for at least 45 years, maybe longer, and it was still active right now, still glowing with that blue-green light, still doing whatever it had been designed or programmed or evolved to do. And Tyler had gotten closer to it than anyone in over 30 years, close enough that his equipment failed the same way dozens of other systems had failed over 4 decades, close enough that someone watching from ships or satellites or monitoring stations had dispatched 3 naval vessels in 35 minutes to make sure he never talked about what he'd seen. Commander Holbrook contacted Tyler 6 days later through official channels, a formal request for a meeting at Naval Station Norfolk that wasn't phrased like a request at all. They met in a conference room that was probably swept for recording devices twice a day, just the 2 of them, and a folder thick enough to be a Bible. And Holbrook's opening words weren't what Tyler expected. You saw about 4% of what's actually there. If you'd seen the other 96%, you'd understand why we can't talk about this publicly. There was no threat in his voice, no intimidation, just exhaustion that came from carrying knowledge that got heavier every year. Holbrook explained that Tyler wasn't the first Navy diver to encounter the emanation of light from that wreckage site. There had been 6 others since 2018, all conducting routine surveys or training exercises, all experiencing identical equipment failures at depths ranging from 250 to 320 feet. All of them had been placed on administrative leave. All had received visits just like this one. All had signed non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties severe enough to end careers and potentially freedom. What Holbrook told Tyler next changed everything about how Tyler understood the choice in front of him. The structure's activity, whatever measurements they were using to quantify that, had increased by 23% since 2018. They didn't know what it was doing, but it was doing more of it, broadcasting or transmitting or calling at frequencies and intensities that were climbing steadily year over year. The naval research stations monitoring it had documented the increase with instruments Tyler didn't have clearance to know about. But the trend line was clear, and it was accelerating. Tyler asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd read the siren call report. What happens if I don't sign the NDA? Holbrook's answer was honest in a way that made Tyler believe every word. Nothing legal, nothing heavy-handed. But if the public panics, if every conspiracy theorist with sonar equipment and a YouTube channel tries to investigate. If civilian vessels start crowding that area, we might trigger something we can't control. You're a father, Mr. Crane. You've got 7-year-old twins. Think about that before you decide whether satisfying curiosity is worth risking what might happen if we provoke a response from something that's already claimed 10 submarines, and God knows how many lives over 45 years. Tyler signed the papers, not because he was afraid of legal consequences or career destruction, but because Holbrook was right about the essential math. If the thing at 847 feet had been pulling submarines down for nearly half a century, and nobody understood how or why, then flooding the area with civilian vessels and amateur investigators might turn a contained mystery into an active catastrophe. The NDA was 23 pages long, covered everything from criminal penalties to civil liability, prohibited him from discussing the dive, the light, the hexagon pattern, Operation Siren Call, or any related information with anyone who didn't have appropriate clearance, which in practical terms meant he couldn't tell anyone anything ever. He returned to active duty 6 weeks later, assigned to training operations in shallow water far from the Atlantic continental shelf, and life resumed its normal patterns with one significant difference that Tyler noticed immediately. Evan Parker stopped returning his calls, and when Tyler checked NOAA staff directories, Evan's name had been removed. He found out through a mutual contact that Evan had accepted a position with an Australian Marine Research Institute, moved to Perth 3 weeks after their meeting, took his family, and didn't leave a forwarding address. Brady got transferred to San Diego, effective immediately, a reassignment that usually took months of paperwork, but somehow got processed in 9 days. The official recovery operation on the Soviet submarine was concluded and filed with a determination of structurally unsound for salvage, abandoned in place, which meant the wreck would stay exactly where it was at 295 feet, glowing with its impossible light, connected by some unseen cable to whatever was waiting at the center of the hexagon. The exclusion zone around the area was quietly expanded from the original 5 nautical miles to 15 nautical miles, officially designated for ongoing naval exercises, which was bureaucratic language for keep out and don't ask questions. Tyler kept diving, logged another 140 dives over the next 18 months, trained new master diver candidates, conducted inspections and surveys up and down the Atlantic coast. But he never went back to that region, never took contracts or assignments within 50 miles of those coordinates, and when other divers asked if he knew anything about the expanded exclusion zone, he said what he'd been told to say, that it was classified naval operations and he didn't have information to share. In March of 2024, a commercial fisherman operating legally outside the exclusion boundary reported unusual bioluminescence approximately 68 nautical miles east of Virginia Beach, exactly where one of the hexagon vertices should be, according to Tyler's calculations. Coast Guard investigated within 12 hours, declared it an algal bloom, advised fishing vessels to avoid the area for environmental reasons. 2 weeks later, the exclusion zone was expanded again, this time to 20 nautical miles. No official explanation provided beyond vague references to habitat protection and ongoing research. Tyler saw the updated maritime charts and knew exactly what that expansion meant. The structure was still active, still doing whatever it had been doing for at least 45 years, and its influence was spreading outward along those geometric lines, connecting the submarines like a web slowly growing across the seafloor. He still takes his twins to the beach sometimes, lets them play in the waves and search for shells in the sand, and sometimes he looks out at the horizon and thinks about what's underneath those waves 73 miles offshore, 847 feet down, pulsing with blue-green light that nobody can explain. Tyler knows what's down there. The Navy knows what's down there. And now you know what's down there too. The question that keeps him awake some nights isn't what it is or where it came from. The question is what happens when it finishes whatever it started 45 years ago, or maybe longer, because nothing that organized, nothing that patient, builds a pattern like that without a purpose. And that purpose, whatever it is, isn't finished yet.